Thank you everyone for joining today. Hope you're having a nice conference so far. For those who don't know me, I'm Roth Michaels. I'm a principal software engineer at Native Instruments. And I came to Native Instruments through Isotope because we're now a big family of Isotope, Native Instruments, Plugin Alliance, and Brainworks. So these days I'm working supporting teams kind of across all three of the brands, but most of these stories you'll hear from today are from my Isotope days. So as I said, slides here because this is mostly story time, no code, but hopefully it'll give you some interesting stuff to think about. Before I begin most of my talks, I was inspired by a panel I saw on diversity a number of years ago before I was a speaker that asked speakers to encourage other people to give talks. So while I have a lot of strong opinions and thought a lot about this, I'm just a guy and person just like everyone else in this room. And so I encourage all of you, if you've not thought about doing a conference talk before, consider it. Everyone probably has something they've learned or interesting to share. And the open mic is also a great chance to kind of get your feet wet. That's kind of the first time I did something like this. And just a little funny AI aside, this picture I made for this kind of slide at a talk a few years ago using Midjourney, asking for a alien version of Rosie the Riveter, which was a US World War II propaganda poster that turned into a feminist icon that my mom had a magnet on her fridge, which inspired this. I was like, oh, what will but she didn't I couldn't get the pose right. So I was like, oh, let me try again. And unfortunately, no matter how I tried to prompt it, I couldn't get an ungendered alien. So I don't know, maybe this one's better. Someone wants to talk to me about maybe new ideas to put on this slide because I've been reusing it afterwards. I would appreciate that. But anyway, back to story time. So before we start talking about software, I have this Rene Magritte painting to show you. So a show of hands, anyone think this is a pipe? It says it's a pipe. Well, actually, this is a painting of a pipe. Well, it's not even really that. It's a slide in Google Slides that someone took a picture of this painting of a pipe. And so this is kind of going to be a big theme of what we're talking about, is you can learn a lot about things without actually having the real thing, but something that gives you the impression or sense of the thing. So some of the topics we're going to talk about are a little bit of inspiration from extreme programming and Agile, the concept of build, measure, learn, and kind of big topic of this talk is like, what really is a prototype and what are they for? And also this concept of MVP that is used in a lot of ways in our industry, not just audio, but software in general. And I think there's a particular set of definitions I think is particularly useful to hold on to, and I'd like you all to think about. And we'll look at some fantasy and real examples of prototyping and MVP techniques. Some things that we're not going to discuss that are also super interesting ways of learning while you're building are things like blind listening tests and the software you can use to do that. There are some links there, a paper I worked on that involves some of that. Also, how to run beta forums or feature alpha testing and that kind of stuff. Also a really good way to learn while you're building something. Also not covered in this talk, but happy to take questions on that afterwards or in the hallway because got plenty to say about all of this also. So I mentioned extreme programming, and there's lots of stuff about extreme programming. And, I love pair programming. But the thing I want to illustrate today is kind of the big change of extreme programming was kind of the end of waterfall development, where you don't plan out everything perfectly and then go build it, but you have this loop of creating plans, communicating, building working software, iterating on this plan. And I want to just highlight that word working software will kind of come up again because we also see it shows up in the Agile Manifesto. One of the 4 principles is preferring working software over comprehensive documentation. And that is a really good thing, but also there's a lot we can do without even having working software. So we shouldn't distract ourselves by, oh, we got to have some working software to test this. And also, this idea has been simplified, and often these days, the Agile community, in not just talking about software, but just kind of planning in general, simplifies this to just a build, measure, learn loop. So you have something you want to learn, you make something to test this, you measure it. If you hopefully learn something or not, you can kind of complete this loop. So one question I pose to people sometimes when they're talking about, I want to make a prototype of some idea, what is it you actually want to try to learn? Because that's actually going to dictate what type of prototype you want to build. And we'll see more about that in a minute. But first, what do we mean when we say prototype? The way I like to describe it is you have an idea and you're bringing it into form somehow to understand something about that idea. Then there's another concept that sometimes gets conflated is another way we kind of can learn about things before we build them is this concept of an MVP, or minimal viable product. Sometimes you might hear this as, oh, we have our MVP list. It's all the features we have to must ship, and then we have this other stuff that's below the MVP line. And usually you maybe don't even ship all the MVP features. And that kind of planning I don't think is useful. I think that is a legitimate definition of the term. I think it came from the game industry, but I like this definition from Eric Ries, the author of The Lean Startup, that an MVP is the smallest version of a product. So it's not actually a product necessarily, that can be delivered with minimal effort to collect maximum amount of learning about customers or a market. And this is kind of both coming from Lean Startup and Sync Dev methodology. We're kind of some of the first people throwing this term MVP around. They both agree on this term. I think it's super useful. Please take this back to your companies and don't just mean MVP is the thing we're going to ship, because just call that your to-do list. So what is the difference between a prototype and MVP? There's some overlap, and that's why I have a Venn diagram here. It's not really worth splitting hairs about, oh, is this exactly a prototype or exactly an MVP? And you can actually maybe use the same thing in both contexts. But I think what really distinguishes them is what you're trying to learn about. With an MVP, you're trying to learn about the customer or the marketplace, and is this something that somebody wants? Does it solve a real problem for somebody? A prototype actually will help you understand how the thing you're making works, what it does, how it feels, how it sounds. And we'll look at a lot of examples of that. And part of coming to the talk, I think not all prototypes, but in our industry, a lot of prototypes are useful when they actually bring in musical gesture. And you can actually combine touching and hearing the prototype to understand what it's going to do. But that's only part of it. There's also a lot of value in some prototypes we'll see that don't necessarily have a gesture involved, or maybe low fidelity gestures we'll see in some examples. So first, let's talk about some examples of prototypes outside of software and what those might look like. So I'm going to kind of talk about two things I'm a fan of. So I'm a fan of Formula One, and there's a 3D printer on the right side of the screen. Can I see a show of hands about who thinks it would be a good idea to 3D print a race car that drives hundreds of kilometers an hour? For everyone online, nobody raised their hand. And they don't do that. But Formula One teams do 3D print individual parts to learn about them. For example, if they're going to make an engine cover, they need to be able to know, well, can the mechanics actually reach the tools they need to install and remove that cover to do repairs in a timely fashion? And they can learn about that without actually making a carbon fiber piece. They can just make a piece of plastic so you do all your screws fit. Another example, I'm an avid and competitive pinball player, and there's a number of steps that big hardware devices go through. We can talk about things in our industry in a moment, but pinball games start off with a kind of prototype called a whitewood that you see on the left, which starts off as a blank piece of plywood, and the designer starts screwing things in. They might use real pieces of wire. They might use cardboard, 3D printed things. And that's all about finding out, how does this game physically play? Is it fun to shoot? Does the ball get stuck somewhere? And that evolves, and they'll do a few iterations of that. And then once they design the game, written some very early code, have artwork, then they need to figure out how to actually have people build these things. And so next stage is a manufacturing prototype, where they'll build one or two games to figure out actually, okay, how do we put this thing together for a production-ready model that's not going to fall apart? And then once they do that, you can have an assembly line and put it together. And that's very similar to, manufacturing in our industry. Before you can actually build up an assembly line and all the tooling, you need to have some prototype to understand the software. So this is a new piece of NI hardware, and I'm coming much from the software world, but just to mention a few things that go into prototyping hardware. Sometimes you might have physical prototypes, like I said, made with 3D printers. Prototype circuit boards that are made in small batches, maybe even stuff on a breadboard. The last time I did my own hardware work was certainly a prototype. It was for a biometrics music project where you would dance and that would influence the music. And so we had a pulse oximeter I made on a breadboard, and you had to tape it to the person, and they could dance for about 3 minutes before the whole thing fell apart, and I'd have to rebuild it for the next person. But it was a cool demo. So what is an MVP then, if it's not a prototype? So I'm going to give you kind of an illustrative example. Should I build this Rebird plugin I've been dreaming of? So a number of years ago, when I was the tech lead for our mixing and mastering software at Isotope Ozone, we were coming up with real-time source separation technology to readjust the balance of either your vocals, bass, or drums. I thought, oh, it might be a cool, fun plugin and use that to take out your vocals and replace it with flamingo sounds. I think this would be a great plugin, but I don't know. I couldn't, maybe it won't sell. I should probably do a little research before I try to start writing C++ or convincing my manager or PMs we should build this. So one simple kind of minimal viable product you can do is called the landing page MVP, where you put up some information about this saying, hey, do you want to try out this new Rebird plugin? Sign up here and get more information. And how much engagement you get with this page and if people actually give you their email is a signal they want to know more about this. But we don't need to stop there. Like we could maybe before building a plugin, we could maybe make a web app that does this and people could test that out as maybe a minimal way to do this. But we can get even smaller with something called the concierge prototype, where we don't actually build anything in the cloud. We just make something where someone sends their file, it gets emailed to someone at Isotope, they download the file, do the work on their computer and send it back. And you didn't actually have to build out any of the infrastructure for this. And if people like the results, then you know, oh, we might build this out. If they don't, then we don't. And sadly, it's been 5 years and I've not made my Flamingo Reverb plugin. Anyway, let's talk about a real example of an MVP that I called the sound file MVP. Sorry, it's a bit hard to see these dark plugin UIs on this screen, but there's this triangle in the middle of this reverb product, Neoverb, and what that allows you to do is blend different kinds of reverb sounds. And this was a concept that the product manager working on this had heard from some mix engineers. Also, it's a classic thing going back to Sinatra, where they would have nice big live rooms at Capitol Records, and that would have some reverb in it. Then they would also use plates as well and mix those reverbs. So this is like known quantity, but we weren't really sure, do our users want this? So the way we tested this is we gave them 3 different reverb pre-processed sound files with a dry sound file and 3 files with reverb on them. Just asked them, put this on tracks and adjust your faders and send us a screenshot. And almost all the users were using 2 or 3 of the reverbs. I don't think we had a single screenshot of one, and that gave the team internal confidence that yes, this mixing reverbs concept is actually a cool concept. So we'll come back to a few other examples of prototyping in this product later. But since I mentioned interacting with some of our users, I want to briefly talk about user testing. So user testing we can do both with prototypes or MVPs. The thing I'm calling out about user testing versus the things like the landing page MVP, this is something just public and you're testing it in the whole marketplace. But with user testing, that's usually a much smaller scale individual activity where you're showing people either a prototype they interact with or other kinds of MVPs for the test. So some non-prototype things that are super useful in user testing are things like you can make a concept video where you mock up how the product will work, and then the user can see that, and you can watch them watch the video, see what they get excited about, ask them what parts they understand, what they think the features do. You can also have fake marketing pages and see what features people click on to learn more about. Or you can make kind of high fidelity click-through prototypes that they can click around and see what, if they actually know where to find things in the user interface. You can ask them, what do you think this knob does? And through a mix of these things, we were working on Neutron 4, our mixing plugin at Isotope. Some of this information from both the fake marketing and the landing page, if you look, this is what our kind of assisted view was going to look like in the concept video. But we learned from these user tests that people were really excited about having a lot of different targets that they could specify. Oh, I want to go for this kind of instrument or this kind of instrument, or even load their own reference audio to help assist them. And that was not initially part of this concept you see here, but by showing people these mock-ups, we saw that they were really excited about that, and that got elevated, and we deprioritized some other features. But that is not a plugin, and this is not a pipe. So how do we actually take it a next step and actually get closer to understanding the real thing we're making? Again, this is where we get back into prototyping and gesture. So software prototyping and, copying slides around. I guess that shouldn't say sound file MVP on that one anymore, but that should say tools, because there's a lot of different tools available for us for software prototyping. And I encourage you not to just find one tool, but try to learn as many as possible, because they're all useful in different ways, and some can be faster than others for different kinds of projects. So first, I want to call out a few technologies that have been spoken about this year and last year at ADC, Signal Flow, a Python library, C Major, a new language, and I will call it Klang to not confuse anyone, but Clang Studio, a C++ derived language, lets you interactively edit in the DAW. If you've not seen talks on these topics, I highly recommend you check it out. They're all, I think, very useful tools, both for teaching and prototyping. And you can actually use these things for production projects as well, which that's kind of a interesting topic when it comes for prototyping, because if you can use it in production, you might become attached to it and not want to throw it away. And personally, I really like making prototypes that I throw away. I don't actually throw them away. I save them away. And a few years later, someone might ask me, oh, hey, I want to do a Hack Days project based on the spatial audio prototype you did a few years ago on your distance fader. Can you show me the max patch and we could take a look? So, but I find it's okay you want to be able to be okay to throw away your prototypes, because your ideas might not work and you might find better ones. So going to the kind of other end of the extreme from those technologies I showed you, the easiest prototypes to throw away are paper prototypes, where you just kind of draw what you think the UX will be. You might just ask people where they'll click on it, or, hey, what do you think that top view is showing you? Or what do you think that bottom view is showing you? And this is a real product we'll see in a minute. And then you can take those and you can make high fidelity mockups. And there's actually a click-through prototype where you can actually see users click this button, they get new views, etc. And so that's a good way you can actually learn about the UX and what it's like to use the product. So that we're learning more about the product versus its other kind of tests we did earlier. We're actually learning about what features does someone want. We know this is the feature set, but what is it like to use? Do people understand it? We also have built a lot of internal tools that we can use for prototyping. If you see on the left, RX, we have this kind of special build that allows us to load DSP that we've built without any UI and just auto-generate UIs. We have some kind of in-house VST plugins that can load our VSTs as well and load UIs. A lot of prototyping in Jupyter notebooks and Python. We have some Python VST hosts that won't mention which one for trademark reasons. I should have Reactor on here as an internal tool as well, but my internet connection in the hotel room was bothering me when I tried to find a Reactor picture. So imagine there's Reactor in that corner. Another kind of technology we built out for prototyping is leveraging the web for stuff. And so this is a plugin, ISO Labs, that we built and shipped to our Music Production Suite Pro subscribers at Isotope. And what this is Morph one prototype that allows instrument to instrument or voice to instrument conversion in real time. But this is not the only thing that ISO Labs does. This plugin talks to a web endpoint and will download a DSP library and show UI hosted on the web. And that'll actually allows us to ship new ideas to customers without our subscribers, without even needing to ship them a new plugin. We do have a warning there on the bottom saying, bounce your stuff because this is a prototype and it could change any day. Also, one of my, I'm a long-time Max user, so one of my go-to tools that I like to use and recommend using for prototyping is Max, not only because can be a fast way to work on some projects, but also it can host almost any other language you might want to work in. So you can, out of the box, you can do JavaScript, Java. I heard that maybe you can do some C major in there. You can do Lua, you can do C Sound, you can do RTC Mix. The list goes on and on and on. We built some of our own extensions to work with our DSP in Max, and I'll kind of show some examples of learnings we've had from Max-based prototypes as we get to some examples later. But also a simpler version maybe of working with Max if you're less experienced with it, or it says maybe a bit daunting to kind of because it's a little bit more like programming than just pure data flow stuff, there's this plugin from DDMF called Meta Plugin that allows you to take existing plugins and wire them together with other pieces of DSP, like some filters or crossovers, inverting signals, gains, etc. So you might say like, oh, well, we have this idea, like we know this thing exists in this product of ours, and it's this competitor product. And what if like we put things together this way? So one of our PMs on the Boston teams actually is using this quite a bit to try out ideas by pulling together existing isotope products and being like, well, what if we use this piece from over here, this piece over here, this piece over here? And he's able to work quite quickly in that because he's not as fluent in Max. And speaking of Max, our new version of our trash plugin, the PM that worked on this, I think PM and sound designers, I think prototyped every feature in this in a Max patch before they decided which features they were going to bring into this new version of Trash. So what are some reasons you might want to do prototyping other than just to learn strictly about that thing? One is to maybe get buy-in from your colleagues that, yes, this is a good idea worth pursuing, and also to give yourself confidence. So those paper prototypes I was showing you earlier is what ended up this product tonal balance control, which does kind of two things. It shows you either in this bar graph view or a more smooth spectrum view what your audio is doing compared to some reference audio. Then we give you a bunch of targets. You can also load your own set of sound files to calculate a reference. So you kind of have a suggestion. It's not as a strict guide, but kind of a conversation like, where do I fit in this audio? And then you could look at spectrum of various tracks of your mix and then maybe make settings based on that. And when the PM that had this concept was talking to the team, not all the team was fully bought in that this was a useful idea for people or was going to work. And so he built this prototype in Max on the left. I think it took him only a day or so, and he said he would have been able to do it a lot faster if he wasn't about 5 years out of practice in using Max. And while the math in that graph is not the same on the one we use on the right, it is like showing you basically as the more green it gets, the closer you are to your spectral target. And once people actually saw this working with live audio, the discussions of, is this an idea worth pursuing, didn't happen anymore. Another example of this is some upgrades we made to our Nectar voice modeling plugin. There's a voices module for doing harmonization. And in the past, that would just, you kind of had to manually determine all of your harmony notes, et cetera. But we wanted to give some assistance to users to help them come up with harmonies to put in, as well as some voice leading features you were interested in looking into. So you don't necessarily just have static harmonies. And this idea first came up in an ideation session before we were getting into this project. And one of our researchers had an idea for a system of voice leading that you could apply if you kind of knew some information about the key of the track and other things. He had a proposed algorithm. He made a Jupyter notebook with Python to show how this worked. And even though it actually, conceptually, as a composer myself, it was a solid idea. But seeing it in the Jupyter notebook did not generate a lot of excitement with the team and around the company. But we had this, often we kick off projects with an innovation sprint, kind of focus the whole team on prototyping and testing as many ideas as possible. And so one of the folks on the team working on Nectar took inspiration from that, made a Max prototype. The voice leading algorithm was actually more naive than the original one proposed, but it could now be played with in a DAW. And now trying it in context, it was a much more exciting idea to see this in a Max for Live patch in Ableton Live versus seeing someone demo a Jupyter notebook. Prototyping can also be useful for UX design and really understanding your product and what gestures are going to work and what controls do you need to have where in your product. And again, this is why I have this big overlap in the Venn diagram of prototypes that involve gesture are a big fan of mine. So going back to, again, another very dark colored isotope plugin, if we look at this blend pad where we blend the 3 reverbs, we initially did not know this was going to be a triangle to blend the 3 reverbs or what the main UX of this product was going to be. Like, is it going to be focused on the reverbs, on reverb time, room size? And so one of our UX designers led us through a sketching session where we sat down for a couple of hours and the whole team drew as many ideas as they could come up with for, oh yeah, maybe we can control the reverb mix this way or room size this way or reverb time this way. And after about 2 hours of this, we had so many paper prototypes. How are you going to go from that to deciding what's the right thing we want to build? Some of that takes a little bit of intuition. So the designer and the PM kind of filtered that down to some ideas they thought were more viable. Some reminded them of ideas that were looked into for past products. And they decided they wanted to focus on the blending of the reverbs for testing this user experience. And then, room size and reverb time, we can use knobs like normal controls for that. But the team was also kind of anxious to well, we've got deadlines. We got to start writing C++. How much testing can we do to just decide this one widget in the UI? So I kind of wanted to prove a point that yes, we always have time for a little bit of learning and a quick prototype. So I made this max patch in an Uber ride to the office just to demo how easy it is to quickly put something together. This one didn't work really well, but you see kind of the early versions of that blend pad on the right. And on the left, we have this XY pad that lets you control a plate in the hall and then a slider for early reflections. And then in the middle, we just have 3 sliders, like the sound file prototype, letting you kind of control the mix of all 3. We did some hallway testing with this and kind of just saw how people reacted and realized 3 sliders, too much work. We need a simpler gesture for this. So we decided we wanted to test the thing on the left, XY, plus a slider for early reflections, or a triangle to mix all 3. So we built a Max for Live device that would show one or the other UI, and we would bring users in to test, and it was mostly actually internal users, so we wanted some really fast feedback that day before we even started showing it to external folks. And sometimes users would see this first, sometimes they would see this first, and we'd show them both. And we actually learned that most users had a preference for this one, but some, actually the more kind of expert engineer-minded folks, liked this one a little bit better, but that kind of gave us the confidence to go in this direction, kind of the overwhelming support and the kind of fun we saw people having exploring that. The next, we did another Max for Live patch to test this product. We have a reverb assistant feature that kind of, instead of having all the controls here, and there's many more hidden in an advanced panel, we wanted to give you a very simple set of controls to get started, set up some simple unmasking to get out of the reverb tail. So this is what the screen looks like in the end. It has a simple slider for style, size, dry, wet, and then a clean, dark, bright, or airy as options. And this came from a paper prototype designed by one of our sound designers. Rachel Alex put this together, and her initial idea is, well, we probably want to have some notion of what type of instrument you're using this on. So we have an instrument type menu, and she wanted this realistic to dramatic slider and a size for small, medium, and large. And we were like, okay, I can make a Max patch that does this. So I said, okay, Rachel, give me the settings for every instrument type, what the range of the sliders should do, and these buttons for every instrument type, and I'll mock it up. And so we did this here. And again, did the same thing, although we did not bring people into our mastering studio because it was the pandemic. So we need to learn how to start doing user testing over Zoom and have people remote control Ableton Live. And luckily, it actually worked super well. And so you see we have the options that the user has there, and they have a cancel and accept button. But what we noticed users were doing is they were in this assistant mode, and then they go back to this mode to adjust the dry wet slider, and then go back to the assistant mode. And so we realized 2 things. One, from a sound design perspective, it actually wasn't super useful, and it felt limiting to have a fixed menu of instruments. So we got rid of that and decided on adding things like bright and airy instead. But the real revelation was realizing that users had to go back and forth between the main UI and the simplified UI to get dry wet. So we add dry wet right here. So they didn't need to do that. And I guess I was talking a bit fast. This was, a shorter talk given at another conference. So we're kind of getting near the end. I do want to remind you, kind of conclusion, always thinking about build, measure, and learn. This distinction of prototype and MVP, I'll remind you again, prototype is bringing an idea into form, and MVP is to learn about your customers or the market. And most importantly, you should really know what it is you're trying to learn before you go out and start building something. And I actually saw this coming up recently. We were discussing on a team, okay, are we going to go off and build a prototype for this and then show it to users? And we're like, well, do we need to do that? Or is this an idea that we can just test with a marketing video? And so we kind of went off in both directions, PM and design, testing some ideas with marketing videos, and other developers prototyping things either with some of our internal tools, Max, et cetera. I'm actually very excited to see next week what stuff they came up with. But that's kind of the stories I had to share with you, and I'm glad we do have some extra time. So hopefully, people have questions and we can have discussion, and I can get into some more details on any of these topics or tools if anyone is interested. So thank you very much.